We introduce our next speaker. Great guy. We had him at our Pints and Politics down in Waniwak. That was back a little bit ago, and let me tell you, it was very good information regarding two big things that John Pudner's going to talk about. Maybe we'll take some time if people want to get a drink or something. But before he starts, John Pudner, a friend of mine, did great work for the Brad Schimmel campaign. Many of you know his outfit had a flyer that had both Spanish and English languages on it to tell people about how conservative Brad Schimmel was and how important that is. So let's give a big round of applause to John Pudner.
Appreciate it.
And leave the question and answer to the end when John finishes up, if that's possible.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I just want to start by thanking Carol, because PGI called me a few months ago and said, hey, is there some place, we've got a great speaker, is there some place in Wisconsin she should speak? And I said, yes, Juneau County, because I was sitting here 2 years ago in the same room, a few of you may remember, and I just feel like there are kind of three pods to protecting our freedom right now. And the first one, she was just eloquent on, is lawfare, is stopping lawfare. So that's one of the three. I mean, we've seen everything from what they tried to do to President Trump, imprison him, bankrupt him, and this goes after every school. We see the fights in 7th and 8th grade battles and the amazing things they do, like liberals sent a student they said was transgender into the school to argue that he should be able to wear the girl's uniform at the school. I mean, this was a battle. It was all a setup to attack and follow. And the kid was all boy. That's what I try to tell you. The kid wanted to play football. The kid wasn't playing with dolls. He was tackling people. His parents were telling him to, wear a skirt to school. So, just remember who the real problem is. So there's obviously the lawfare. She's been eloquent on that. No need for me to rehash. I think everyone knows those battles. And thank you for covering that. PGI has been such a champion. The second one, when I did speak here 2 years ago, I don't know if you remember, but I actually brought another speaker that time, Jack Anderson. He was the president of the University of Wisconsin Turning Point chapter. And that's who I had speak, kind of introduced him and had him speak. And for me, that's the second of the three prongs, is academe. The battle in academe. And my goodness, this was Charlie Kirk's mission, really. The center of it was on the campuses. Can we keep having universities that try to create credibility to the transgender movement, that try to say it's good to confuse these kids? They're doing the bidding of a billion-dollar industry that wants to sell supposed medical supplies to kids who are a little confused. And so, that battle is so important. And that's one we fought a bit. We were able a few years ago to expose in Newsweek, took a piece from us actually, it was a counterpoint to something they'd written on how the president of UPenn University was getting $50 billion in Chinese money, creating the Penn Biden Center to pay Joe Biden $1 million a year for teaching a class that he never showed up for. So this is a Newsweek piece we did a few years ago, but just academe, the level they'll go to, but as corrupt as that is, for me, the credibility they've tried to give the transgender movement, or whatever you want to call it, is the catastrophe. And people talk about, having compassion. I just want to make one point. My big hang-up is confusing the word empathy with compassion. You can have empathy for a heroin addict and say, hey, you just live a different life than me, Hey, I'll get along, you get along. That's not compassion. Compassion is seeing someone with a problem and trying to help them. And if you look at one of Charlie Kirk's great interviews, he had a transgender advocate, a transgender person who was identifying as a woman, as I say. And if you read the back and forth, all this, he wants to kill you, all this hate-filled stuff that leads to someone doing something like last week. And if you read his words, he's like, no, I want you to be at peace. I want you to understand, appreciate the body that was given to you. I mean, it's really eloquent. And I'm not doing it justice here. But just to see that, no, we want to stop that, but we want to stop that person from becoming a monster or very confused. I mean, the kid, the children who were shot in the Catholic school a couple weeks earlier, transgender, and his post saying, I wish people hadn't lied to me. I mean, he knew he was confused, So the idea that this transgender, feeding a billion-dollar industry, in order to just confuse and prey on these kids, yeah, they're victims too, but we got to get them before they're monsters. And that's why Charlie has these people on campus, and I was glad to bring Jack Anderson here. And the third one I just want to touch on a little bit is law enforcement, I think, is the third one. Not to go overboard on my age, but one of my early campaigns was for Ollie North. I was a big field guy for him and went around. And I just remember I learned from him, every officer he said, I want to thank you for that thin blue line. And that just made an impression. As someone who was just, younger then, in my 20s, wow, that's right. I mean, I've never been in law enforcement. It's a thin line. I mean, they're outnumbered. They're outnumbered. They have to have support from us. And so just this whole law enforcement and what can we do? And we've got, driving through Milwaukee, I mean, the news there, these guys just take over blocks and spin their cars and shoot off fireworks. Police can't do anything for hours. And they've interviewed a liberal mayor of Milwaukee, obviously a Democrat and all, and said, hey, what are you going to do about this? They says, we just don't have enough officers. We have one pull up and watch just to see if somebody, but he can't intervene. It's a mob there. I've only got one officer. I mean, it's that bad in these systems. And just so I think that third one is just, is law enforcement, being able to keep us safe. And look, there, obviously, we have what happened last week, staring us in the face, the extreme. So, and just the fact that we don't have enough law enforcement. And ironically, a few weeks ago, I was in a presentation. I went to Huntsville, Alabama, because I'd heard about how finally officers are getting some more help from drones, how they can go in and scope out. And, of course, you have a mass shooter or something like last week. Just thinking, as I'm feeling there crushed, assuming the news was bad on Charlie, throughout the day. We all did, but you're waiting those couple hours. And just think, gosh, they're just starting to get these drones out to law enforcement, an open air event, and this group, the Skyfire, took me through their whole, it's amazing. They went in and how they get in, they get there before the officers can, or an open event. You can be, looking down and you can see something like this nutcase. And so we just have to hope that we can give the tools, in addition to returning respect to law enforcement and getting past this idiotic defund the police that's led to so much suffering. But just to use technology like that and think, and the other thing is just the time officers have to waste. And I'm sure if any of you at law enforcement, and I haven't been, but it's all the extra calls. Someone sees something and you're going out and you're spending 40 minutes getting to place, filing a report when nothing was happening. And just to see how these drones can do things like they had a case where someone, they were showing me a recording, they were showing me some live, and they were showing a recording, they're sitting there in the 911 center. They get the 911 calls and they send the drone out to be the first responder. It's amazing. And just seeing, but they showed me this two recordings I'll just mention to you. One was a nothing issue, but it looked like it. A person, probably like me, a little gray hair, was lying down outside of kind of a Papa John's. And of course people called and said, oh my gosh, I think someone collapsed. Some older guy there, gray hair, and he's lying there, please. So what does that say in fact? The ambulance, the police, someone's doing a report. Well, thank goodness there was nothing there. The drone's there in 45 seconds and sends back pictures not only of the guy lying there eating a pizza because he decided to lie down and eat, but you could see the pepperonis, on the pizza. So that's one where, hey, you don't have to go out. The ambulance doesn't have to go there. The police don't have to go there. Just these things we can do to help them. And then the other video they showed, I didn't see this live. I was watching the drones go out live. It really is amazing. I hope they put these out. But was unfortunately a domestic abuse problem. There was a problem, and this guy had gone in. Clearly, the wife had gotten to the 911, or wife or girlfriend, and the guy had his whole escape route planned. And it was like he was out, he was under this porch that he knew was there, then he was down this creek, then he was through these trees. It was one of the most elaborate, pre-thought out. Like literally, I'm going to beat this woman, and then I've got my escape route. Pops up on the rural road and gets tased. Because luckily these things have infrared. They watched him underground. They watched him through trees. So I just have to hope, and every time there's a tragedy, you hope that just let's give law enforcement those tools they need. And can we, these outdoor events, if we're going to have them, can we, God help us just use the technology we have to catch these guys and not to be shy about it. So anyway, that's the little touch on law enforcement. Getting past the tragedy that just happened, there's other law enforcement like money laundering. And this was one of the first issues I took on 10 years ago was Act Blue. And I just want to tell you, we were about to have a big story last Wednesday, and obviously the news overwhelmed everything. Real clear politics about to break. But Wisconsin has just introduced the first state-level legislation to ban Act Blue's practice. These guys have moved billions of dollars in unverified contributions, meaning, unlike anything else you buy, they have told their processors since 2004 until earlier this year that you cannot ask for the CVV code, the address verification. No one does that unless they want to open the door for laundering. I mean, can you imagine hey, I'm actually ordering a car with a credit card. Great. One thing we don't want to see is your address or CVV to know if this is really your credit card or not. Leave the keys. I mean, it's that absurd. And yet Act Blue has done this for billions of dollars, and we've known it for years. The reason I'm so glad a bunch of Wisconsin state legislators signed on to a bill, and it's Bill AB 385, and there's a Senate companion, but please look it up, because this is the way the money in politics has been rigged to the left for so many years. And what this does is it says to the bank processors, you're not allowed to process money that way for any kind of political or ideological gain. It's really after 10 years of study. I wrote the first white paper on it back in 2015 on the process that was being used. And I think this is the enforceable way because bank processors are very risk adverse. If you're trying to rip people off and move money in from Bank of China, you're probably will take the risk. But a bank processor can now tell Act Blue, hey, I'm sorry, that's actually illegal. I have to ask for that information. And Act Blue for years said you cannot process our $500 million we're going to run through you unless you do an unverified process. I mean, it was just it was like saying you can't use fingerprints in a murder investigation. It was just absurd. There's no other reason for it. And so what we documented, and I will say the only time ever, for the record, that President Trump has retweeted something I did was in 2020. We exposed that 48% of all of the donors going through Act Blue in 2019 were listed as unemployed, no employer. So people without a job got $484 million that year alone into liberal candidates and causes. So it's just, I mean, that's the money. So just this, to enforce basic common sense laws. And I will say, to be clear on the record, Act Blue a few months ago said, oh, now we're starting to allow verification. Well, he did that because Brian Stiles has done a great job of investigating them. The day that investigation ends, they can change that policy. So we're saying, now's the time. Pass the bill. You're saying you're doing this now for the first time since 2004. Let's make it a law. So I really hope we've had a lot of other states call us since we announced that they want to copy Wisconsin's legislation. So those are just kind of the three. I guess I tend to put things in pods. I did one talk last year where I talked about kind of the three pods of how they move money, which is Planned Parenthood, Act Blue, and Soros, basically. But I think these are the three things we have to protect. So protect against and defend your freedom. I think those are kind of, if you're more military, I can say the three fronts to the war that I think we have to win. But again, thank you, Carol, for all you're doing on that one, the lawfare one. I mean, we all know, we saw it last year, and I think they finally showed their face with the cases against President Trump. But, President Trump is great at publicizing something. The little Catholic school that's being put out of business does not have the wherewithal to do that. So thank you for another thing. We need a street fighter. I actually had one real moderate Republican friend tell me recently he was the biggest Trump fan in the world, and I was like, I honestly wasn't sure you would be. He said, John, we just need a street fighter. We've been nice for years. We just need a street fighter. I don't really like the guy, but I'm his biggest fan when it comes to voting. So, hey, I'll take it. Whatever gets you. So anyway, but thank you so much here. I do feel like there's some overlap between Wisconsin Faith and Freedom and certainly the national efforts of PGI. And so glad you're here. And talking to office, we're hoping you get around the state, throughout next year. And so I think those missions overlap. And I just think there are going to be cases, all over the country. We know they're going. I think evil has exposed itself. Now there's no question about the things we're fighting. I think they're all laid out now, and that's, of course, the first thing for anyone on a mission. Okay, what is it? I don't think they've left a lot vague. And again, just obviously prayers for Charlie and the family. We could all, talk about that all night, and that's our current blog, but just a little close. I just put a conversation I had with him 2 years ago, and I did not know Charlie well. I don't want to pretend I did. I'm glad other people got to do the accolades. But I just account on their webpage, just Lee's story. And I just saw him a couple of years ago. I was out at an event in California. And I just passing by, I said, oh, hey, Charlie, I realize we have a mutual really good friend, a guy named Brent Hamachek. Not a big name, no. He spun around. Brent had been a mentor of his to get him going in his teenage years and taught him and all, and no publicity. He locked in for 5 minutes on me to talk about his friend Brent and everything he meant to him and just the sincerity. And let's be honest, there's some people in politics who aren't as sincere, who are out for,
Really?
themselves. Yeah, I know. That was actually my headliner today. I hate to break that, but I've worked with politicians. They aren't all sincere. So that's my news for the day. But just to see this good a soul, and my gosh, just to see what's going to come out of this and the good. And we know he's in a better place to watch all the wonderful things that are happening right now. Just prayers with him and his family. And thank you, everyone, for letting me be here. And again, Carol's the star tonight, so if you have any other questions for her, please ask her. Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you coming.
Absolutely.
If everybody wants a freshen their drink or they have to use the restroom or something, you can take 7. Before we start. Or sneak out.
Discrimination of Catholic. On August 27th, on the first day of school, Catholic school children sitting in mass were shot at, possible massacre. We lost 2 children. And this is a personal opinion, because of the rhetoric. And it was somebody who was struggling in their mind and in their life, who really couldn't find anyone to love. And so he targeted the Catholic school children. And I do have one thing to say about that, because I am Catholic, and my daughters all attended. They're all adults now, and one's a freshman at college, and 2 are out of college. But they attended Catholic school. And I'm sure you all heard about how the buddies protected the little ones. State Union of Fox Point, that was called the Guardian Angel Program. But that was the first day of school, right, that they had that mass. The buddy program, the Guardian Angel Program, is the 8th graders will come in, and each one you hear someone in the class. 8th grade goes to 4, 4th grade goes to 3. They had just met those buddies, became those buddies minutes before that shooting. And has not been reported. So you get buddied up with it. And they were protecting those children. And I think about in that church, some of those children had more courage than probably I would. Or people like that.
Holes in the side of foundation as well.
On September 3rd, at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, Senator Tim Kaine, a former vice president of Canada, stated this: the notion that rights don't come from law and don't come from the government, but come from the Creator. That's what the Iranian government believes, he said. It's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Sunnis, Bahis, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. They do it because they believe they understand what natural rights are from their Creator. And he said, so the statement that our rights do not come from our laws or our government is extremely troubling. This is a senator of the United States that is founded on principles of natural law, that rights are inherent and come from a greater being. And he stated this. That was on September 3rd. He forgot, by the way, that Congress Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, 5 days later, I'm getting dressed and I see President Donald Trump on TV holding a press conference on his Religious Liberties Commission that was put in place on May 1st of this year. And May 1st is, I think Trump does everything symbolic because what happens in the communist countries on May Day? They bring out their weapons, right? So he brought out his weapons, the Religious Liberties Commission. And I'm watching this conference and I'm looking back and I'm thinking about what I have experienced over the last 5 years as an attorney with the Pacific Justice Institute, and I thought, I never thought I would see this day 5 years ago. I never thought I would see this government standing up so strong for religious liberties. I mean, we were really in a hole in 2021 when I started the Pacific Justice Institute. And I felt it. And then, a few days later, the champion of religious freedom, debate, and free speech was shot while he was encouraging discourse. He was encouraging conscious thought. He was encouraging faith. And I thought, and I'm sure all of you, where are we going, right? And I think over the past few days, as we try to digest this and we see those leaders, future leaders, I once again am encouraged, and I like to think that this fight for religious freedom, which began before the American Revolution, is still the strong. We're still on the strong side, right? And I know that in the end, good for us. So with Charlie Kirk, though, one thing that kept bothering me is how he has been, and I probably all you, gaslighted throughout all this. Called a fascist, right? So what do fascists do? They restrict speech so they can remain in power. They tell you what the truth is. They don't seek the truth, they tell you what the truth is. And that wasn't Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is encouraging debate, trying to find the truth, right? He wasn't claiming the truth. He was looking for the truth, and he was, in the Socratic method, bringing people to the table and putting himself in the hot seat, right? Putting his beliefs in the hot seat. And you know, in fact, and from what I've heard, is that he about quite a bit, right? When he first started, he was quite a secularist. And then in the end, the thing that he said that he wanted to be remembered for wasn't his faith. It wasn't faith, but it was his courage to have faith. And I thought, wow, in this country, we're going to have courage to have faith. Because our laws protect us, and we should be able to practice freely without fear of retribution, without fear of assassination. So, 250 years after the American Revolution, religious freedom is still something that we all have to fight for. Fiercely. So, since 2021, as I mentioned, it's been kind of crazy. I want to give you, first of all, a bit of the Wisconsin experience. This case was before me. This was by Kevin Snyder, the chief counsel. He came to Wisconsin in 2018 regarding a DePere ordinance that was purportedly to prohibit discrimination in the public sphere. So it was non-discrimination in housing, public accommodation, and employee ordinance. And the ordinance read, discrimination, or discriminatory shall mean any intentional act, policy, advertisement, or practice that has the effect of subjecting any person to differential treatment as a result of that person's actual or perceived family status, gender identity, and or gender expression, marital status, religion, sex, and sexual orientation. So I'm reading that. So you can practice religion, but you have to, if you have a faith that goes against something such as gender transitioning, or gender orientation choices with your faith, or you're someone who practices same-sex, that same-sex marriage is not a marriage, immediately you're out, right? But then you have to be able to respect religion, but whose religion? So, the ordinance also read, place of public accommodation shall be interpreted broadly to include, but not be limited to, places of business or any physical location in the city where accommodation, amusements, goods, or services are provided either free or for consideration. Discrimination in employment prohibition to the above class. The problem with that was DePere intended and admitted that churches and faith-based organizations would be required to handle this ordinance, would be under the purview of this ordinance, right? So 5 churches and a Christian radio station from here reached out to Pacific Justice Institute, and Kevin Snyder brought a First Amendment challenge stating that this ordinance convicted with these organizations' sincere beliefs and practices. This here is saying churches and Christian radio stations and church property, church campuses are places of public accommodation. So a person seeking protection under the conscience law of Wisconsin must demonstrate that their faith is sincere, that their religious beliefs and the practice of their faith is sincere, and that these beliefs face a burden of application under law issues. When those two prongs are met, then the burden shifts to the state that must prove that the law is based on compelling state interest, which cannot be served by a less restrictive alternative. DePere didn't back down. Kevin kept fighting, and in the end, PGI won the vote. Had they not won, churches would have had to open their doors. Or let's say you rent out a banquet hall, right? Or you rent out your church property for Boy Scouts to go, right? And I bring up Boy Scouts for a reason, to touch upon another case in that. They would, if Boy Scouts were practicing in a way, which some do, and the churches couldn't deny them from using their campground because it would be discriminatory. So they would be forced, like the wedding venue in Oregon, to promote or to support practices of religion. And so we were very happy with the outcome of that. It was actually a judge decision that just came down slamming here. My first situation or matter with Pacific Justice had to do with a faith-based organization that had called and reached out to PGI regarding an employee that they brought in that was not, they found out was not adhering to the faith-based organization's religious principles. And this is a complicated case because it is an organization that is a volunteer organization that organizes volunteers from multiple denominations in the community to serve the community, to bring together, so that there's a cohesiveness despite their differences in faith, that they're working together for the community. But the organization was started by a Christian organization with certain views on marriage. And they had this employee that was openly not acting in good faith and faith. So they reached out to PJI and were concerned because this person was so vocal about their practices that were in opposition to the organization's beliefs, and asked for assistance. And our goal is not to take people to court. We're not looking for, the Zinger case is going to put PJI in the map. We're looking for resolution. We're looking for promoting faith and making sure that any violation of instructions of the administration stops there, right? And so we were able to work with the organization and help them develop bylaws and, such things as making your employees have a statement of faith. But in the end, faith-based organizations have a right when they hire ministers or have a ministerial position, they determine who will be in that position. And so this person was not in a ministerial position anyway. But if there is a person that is hired to promote the mission of the ministry, then faith-based organizations have every right to say, I'm sorry, you don't belong here, without fear of discrimination. That ministerial exception is grounded in the First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. The free exercise clause protects a religious group's right to select individuals who will teach its faith. And the establishment clause prohibits the government from being entangled in religious affairs. So having the government come in and say, no, that's not how you practice your faith, is a difficult task, right? The courts don't want to, they don't want to step into it. And if they did step into it, it would be court supervising employee relationship between churches and their ministers. And so our government has been still. And so I mentioned the Boy Scout issue, and that was another matter I had to handle initially, and that had to do with a church that had for years rented out their open space for Boy Scout camping. And as the years went on and the Boy Scout organization was moving away from their principles, they wanted to stop the practices, and there was really a disagreement in the church, because of course, Boy Scouts have such a great and strong and wonderful tradition, but this particular Boy Scout troop and its organization were against the church. And so they didn't know what to do. But if you go back to that public accommodation case here, where once you start opening up your property, so if you're using your property, the church property, whether it be the church or the property, the campus, if you're using it for secular reasons, it opens it up to a public accommodation venue, and then you are open to discrimination laws. So in the end, unfortunately, the Boy Scouts also can't and had to go elsewhere, but the church was stronger and for it. One of the most difficult cases I've handled in Wisconsin had to do with the contested brain death. Contested brain death. I got a call on my husband's birthday around 7 o'clock at night from our attorneys in New York, who had received a call from a physician who fights bad brain death diagnoses. The situation involved a 19-year-old boy who was a fentanyl overdose. 3 months prior, he had an organ donation on his license. He was being an organ donor. He didn't have a health care directive. The family had no choice on how his health care would go. So around 6 o'clock at night on a Saturday, he was found in an overdose situation. He was taken to emergency. And fentanyl lowers your ability, it diminishes your ability to breathe on your own because it's depressing your. And so he needed a breathing machine. And what I learned from this case was that in fentanyl cases, it takes at least 48 hours to get fentanyl out of the system. And that day, the next day, the doctor came in, took him off the breathing machine, put a mirror to his mouth, and for 7 minutes, waited for him to breathe. Looked at the family and said, and walked out. From that minute on, the organ donation procuring company took over his case. So the aunt got a hold of this physician, and there's from an incredible network of trying to make sure when people are diagnosed, brain dead, that it's an accurate diagnosis. Unfortunately, by the time she got a hold of PJI, it was Wednesday. He had been denied hydration and food, and they were prepping his body for organ procurement. The network of individuals between PJI and other organizations that stepped in was phenomenal. In the end, we were able to demand that the hospital at least do the highest rate possible test. Now, I'm not anti-organ donation at all, and I'll explain that later, but this is an individual who had no say, and the people looking after him was the hospital administration and an organ donation procurement company. But in the end, the Friday night, before his organs were harvested, they finally gave him the nuclear flow test, which is the highest level to test for brain death. And of course, by that time, it was too late. And so he was being brain dead, and his organs were harvested. This was such a lesson to me because, as I said, my daughters are all over 18, right? And at 18, well, first of all, at 14, you have to get permission to be in the room with them because of Wisconsin state law, which never was a problem. About acting a little bit too much. I can work it out. The parent-child relationship. But if my child at the age of 18 goes, is comes up conscious for any reason, and I don't have a healthcare directive from them, I have no say in that here. And so the first thing I did, and I recommend this to all of you, and you can go to the Wisconsin Right to Life organization, and they have a healthcare directive that you can download and take to your bank and have witnesses sign. Have a healthcare directive. And if you want your organs donated, donate them. It's a wonderful gift, but have a directive for it. Don't allow what happened to this poor boy happen to you or to your loved ones. I know so many people who have their lives extended and enriched because of organ donation. So I'm not against it, but I just think that we need to have a stronger policy regarding brain death, which, by the way, I found out while I was researching this case that even the American Neurological, now I'm going to get that wrong, because the American Association of Neurological Physicians, I think it is, had just changed their policy to make it stronger, that make so we should be easy brain death diagnosis stronger research. Has that been adopted statewide or nationwide? No. It's a tough case, and it's a tough case about body autonomy, and for me as Catholic, my body's temple, it's a gift from God, and to be treated in such a way, I think, and life, respect life, normal life, but that's not the only. We have these brain death cases across the country. And it's a difficult situation, right? And I hope at some point that this country comes to some sort of agreement. But in the meantime, and I don't want that, but in the meantime, protect yourself with a healthcare plan. Biggest, the largest amount of cases that I have had about COVID-19 mandates. And the vaccine mandates by the Biden administration were so sweet. So I started June 1st with PEI in 2021. Mask mandates for the first issue of schools and employment. And really, is there a religious practice with masks? No, limited, yes, but no provide accommodation in the workplace. Strong test, it has to be a sincerely healthy and totally sincerely based, which is hard, wrong for an employer to attack, but they really can. And if you have a sincerely healthy belief, the employer can still discriminate against you. So Biden tried with OSHA was shut down. Congress was found to not have the authority to do mandates with OSHA. However, in the healthcare workplace, using the Center for Medicaid and Human Services budget and using their arm of the dollar of healthcare organizations, enforce vaccine mandates amongst healthcare workers across the country, as I'm sure you all know. So that's August of 2021, and I start getting calls from a lot of healthcare workers through our office in California. And one individual called me, a nurse called me from Green Bay, and she said, she said, we have like 3 people here that have mentioned. I said, great, I'll drive up and I'll meet you at the local library, and I'll get a small conference room. I showed up, the library was full. My name got out to everybody that this lawyer is gonna come and fight these vaccine mandates. And they were standing around the room, and I sat there and I heard everybody's story. Now, like I said, I lost a neighbor to COVID-19, and it's a real scare. I go into my phone is an infectious disease commission. So, long nights talking to him about this. But the CMS rule, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services by the Biden administration, the rule required employers to provide religious accommodations in accordance with Title VII Civil Rights Act. And that looks, that's really nice, that's nice of them, right? But the fact of the matter is that many hospitals were saying, no, it's too much of an undue hardship. And it's undue hardship because these healthcare workers who have been working throughout the pandemic using personal protective equipment were a danger to their patients and their employees because they were not that they had COVID, but that they were not vaccinated. And this was all done under the Emergency Use Authorization Act. So Title VII said it's unlawful for covered employers, and that means the side of the employer, to fail or refuse to hire or discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, privileges, and terms because of such individual's religion. Title VII defines religion as all aspects of religious observance and practice as well as belief. So I saw from a lot of hospitals across Wisconsin the form, all the observers were given to request a religious accommodation from COVID-19 vaccination. If you were a patient-facing employee, which means you got near a patient, you were denied an accommodation, whether or not you had been employed. And while this was going on, so most of them had to have their religious accommodation approved by October 15th. And if they didn't get it approved, they all had to be vaccinated by November 1st. And this was just kind of following the CMS rule because these hospitals had to have a certain amount of employees vaccinated to keep their Medicare and Medicaid connection. And so Aurora initially was asking all the employees to get a letter from their cashier or their spiritual leader. And quickly that was taken away and Aurora began. I didn't really have it to attend to Aurora Hospital. Bellin was the same way. They accommodated anesthesiologists, they accommodated everyone, and that was the main concern of the day. But not all hospitals or medical schools were as fair. And what was even more problematic was nursing students. Because nursing students, although they're working in a hospital, they're not getting paid, they're not employees. And the only protection they have is Title VI. And Title VI has protection against discrimination, but religion is not part of the mix. So nursing students were dropping out of school. And in the meantime, healthcare workers were quitting, they were tired, they were exhausted from the pandemic, and now they're not getting any respect for their religious beliefs. And PGI does a screening process the best we can to make sure that people are coming to us with sincere practice, right? Religious practice. And the nation was experiencing a healthcare crisis. And then in November, when all of these employees they weren't being fired, they were being deemed, most of them were being deemed voluntarily resigned. And so they couldn't get unemployment insurance. And in fact, in the state of Wisconsin, so that these people who had lost their jobs and were being voluntarily resigned, the healthcare organizations were saying that they weren't following policy, they didn't get the COVID vaccine, and they were being denied, and they had nowhere to go, right? Meanwhile, our health system was we needed healthcare workers. We were losing healthcare workers, right? And you would go to the hospital and they would say, "Oh, we're full." And I'm saying this from personal experience. My mom was suffering dementia at the time, and so in November 1st, it was a mass exodus from some hospitals like Ascension, which is a faith-based organization. And our local hospital, Columbia St. Anne's, I took my mom. I was in the hospital on October 30th with my daughter for diabetes-related issues in emergency room. We were in within 15 minutes. November 11th, I'm in the hospital with my mom, and the waiting room is packed. There's a person there who had been waiting who thought they had a broken arm for 3 hours. And they kept saying, the emergency room's full, the emergency room's full. And I went in with my mom, and meanwhile, they're hiring locum healthcare, which are traveling people from across different states. And they have different vaccine requirements because they're traveling. And so it was dependent upon their organization, right? And whether or not those employees were accommodated, needed it, or were vaccinated, we didn't know. I got into the emergency room, and the emergency room, like 3/4 of it was dark. They just didn't have enough staff. And that's because so many people had lost their jobs. And so PJI represented here in Wisconsin and across the country numerous COVID-19 vaccination cases. Or people who had lost their jobs because of COVID-19. The cases that I was involved with, one involved an orthopedic surgeon who received an accommodation, which was very kind of them. But the accommodation has to be reasonable according to the law, and the accommodation was not reasonable. He was told that he would have to, he was kind of treated like a leper, even though he didn't have COVID, and he already had COVID. And so he was told that he would have to eat his lunch in the car. He would have to remain in personal protective equipment 100% of the time in the hospital. He would have to remain 6 feet away from any employees or patients, and if a patient or anybody asked about his COVID vaccine status, he would have to be truthful, and he would have to prove his vaccination status on his physician, on his patient testimony. Another case involves the gift shop coordinator at a Washington hospital who, after he took the call on her back, had her permanently revoked. And she hurt her back in the work. And so she went, and it was a debilitating injury. She ended up having to have surgery and was out of the workplace workman's comp for 3 months. And the day she's supposed to come back, that case is different. I still didn't go in a good condition. And then there's a case of 2 Catholic residents who were told by their employer how to practice their faith. So this employer had under this accommodation form, like this customer accommodation form, the employees were told that they would have to state a tenet of their religion that conflicted with COVID-19 vaccination. Well, that's not law, because the courts won't tell you what tenet of religion. And certainly an employer can't discern it, and I want to know who was the theologian or whatever the religious leader looking at all the religious accommodations and determining whether or not this is something to faith or not. And so their argument was, being anti-vaxxer is not a tenet of a religion. And because they were Catholics, brought up the Pope, who had stated that it's a moral obligation to get vaccinated. But what they didn't know was that the Pope wasn't talking from his position as the authority of the church. He was talking from his own personal viewpoint. And it was the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith that was determining that vaccine mandates, the very principle of the vaccine mandate, was immoral according to the Catholic faith. And it was up to a person's conscience and their discernment with God on whether or not it was within their faith practices to receive COVID-19 vaccination. was a long, drawn out, 4-year fight. These two individuals had worked their lives to become anesthesiologists and were kicked out of their residencies. Gratefully, they're back on their path to becoming residents because these are the types of healthcare decisions we would want looking over you, because just as much as they practice their faith, they would respect the practice yours. And that's my concern, is that were we directed in a way where anyone of faith was being pushed out of the healthcare? And there were fights. There were fights and fought like dissension of Columbia St. Mary's between vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. It was an awful era in healthcare coming off of a horrible pandemic. The worst case situation was Ascension Healthcare, and that was where I got nearly 100 clients from, because they just wouldn't accept any vaccination. And in the end, because all rights, civil rights, are a balancing act, because Ascension is a faith-based organization, they can practice their faith the way they want it to be. And so the people who were doing their jobs were denied unemployment. So perhaps strengthening faith-based organizations, but not so with that, city persons have operated in Wisconsin, but we fight for churches on property issues, tax issues. Do you want to have a school in your basement? We help the individual as much as possible. We fight for parent rights. And so we're here. And not only do we have the day of Wisconsin attorneys and the connection to the Christian Legal Society, but you have the PJIF network nationwide at your disposal. So cards are distributed. If you want any information, or if you do need legal help for any reason, we also have an organization and churches. Please reach out. It's free. We do fight for the district.